calling today. Jesus is calling the weary to rest, calling today, calling today. Bring him thy burden and thou shalt be blessed. He will not turn thee away.
All right. Starting the study of Habakkuk tonight, and I want to start off with an illustration. And I want to kind of ask you what maybe seems a little difficult about this. If you can imagine being gathered together on maybe a study like this, middle of the week, maybe you go through a chapter like Romans chapter 13, talks about submitting to governing authorities. And the next day you have to drive to a metro area, big city, and there's a policeman there who's got his radar gun ready to go. And at the same time, he has just spent the night before committing adultery on his wife. He got himself drunk and is now back on the job. And in doing that, as you drive along, you kind of get caught in a swarm of drivers. And the speed limit's 60, but the swarm's going 70. And out of that swarm, he picks out your car and then pulls you over. And in doing that, when he comes to the window, you can smell the alcohol on his breath. He gives you a ticket for $135. And as you drive away, what are you thinking? You don't know exactly what he was doing the night before, but you can guess a little bit. By the way, this is not a true story and not some political statement either. But just tell me, after you pulled away, what would you be thinking? Shouldn't have been speeding.
I'd probably be thinking I shouldn't be speeding, but I'd probably be thinking he shouldn't be driving if he's been drinking.
Okay, he shouldn't be driving. Two wrongs don't make a right.
I'd ignore the ticket and just turn in the cop and tell the people that he was drunk and say, why should I pay the ticket when I got pulled over by a guy with a gun?
Ken's going to jail. We might think, why did they pick me out? Out of all those people, why me? Now, what you may not realize in the story, he gets fired that next day. Now, at the moment, you don't see any of that. All you see is your place in time. You think, you know what, everybody else around me was going the same speed. Why am I the one who gets picked out? Sometimes we have great difficulty with looking at other people who are more wicked than us being the ones that bring down a judgment upon ourselves. And we start to cry out what kind of words? Not fair? Why me? Injustice? We start to think through those type of words, don't we? Now, when you look at the book of Habakkuk, that is exactly the thought that is at hand. Not in terms of police, not in terms of those kind of things. But here Habakkuk is, a prophet, sent to take this message to Judah and to tell them, as part of it, it's a different kind of prophecy. Because so often we see these Old Testament prophets as bringing a message from God to a people who need to hear some instruction to change. This one's a little bit different. Habakkuk is actually going to come and he sees the situation at hand. He sees that the Chaldeans are coming, which are a much more wicked people than the people of God. Yet that's not saying a whole lot, because God's people had gotten away from who God was and his commandments. And yet he starts to wonder, God, how can you use these Chaldeans to come and pass judgment to destroy us, your people? Now, can you understand why Habakkuk has a little bit of a question for God? Are these similar kinds of questions that we think of? That we go, this doesn't seem fair. This doesn't seem right. What is God doing here? How easy is it to question, God, what are you doing? Now, you can look at those kind of questions and you can ask them in two different ways. You can ask them saying, God, help me understand. Or you can ask them being kind of snarky toward God, questioning whether he has the real ability to see what's going on. Now, one of those comes from a spiritual mindset. One of those comes from a very fleshly mindset. Now, if you think through the illustration we started with, for the one person who gets pulled out of the group, you might think, well, man, everybody else is doing the same thing. Why would God make sure we would be the one who would get pulled over? Need a lesson. Sometimes we need a lesson because we're called to something higher, aren't we? Richard?
Scripture said God, he chastens those he loves.
Right. And that's the exact point of going, hey, he's going to discipline those that he loves. You see that in Proverbs, you see it quoted in Hebrews, same kind of things.
Well, God always wants us to ask questions. That's why the Bible describes God as the Father. As Jesus and him gathering his sheep. He wants us to rely on him. But what do we do about it?
Right.
Are we asking, like, questioning God in a kind of haughty way, or is it
In a humble way.
or in a humble way?
Right. And you think about it, in asking these questions to seek out God for the answer. And that's exactly what you see in Habakkuk. Now, as you may notice up on the screen behind, if you still have the charts that Brennan handed out with Nahum, you kind of see this is just kind of the listing of the kings of Judah as they go down through. And you kind of see how it's broken out. We've already been through Nahum. We saw the judgment that God brought upon Nineveh and the Assyrians in 612 BC. Nineveh goes down. And yet at the same time, you see how that fits together with who the kings are. I want you to notice that Habakkuk comes in right after Josiah. And if you really take time to look at Josiah, which we're going to take just a little bit of time to look at, actually look over at 2 Kings chapter 22. If you take the time to kind of add up the years, Josiah's years are 31 total, and the first 18 are kind of indifferent, but the last 13 are fantastic. I mean, he goes after God, you'll see, with all of his heart, all of his soul, all of his might. And he really brings in a reform that really changes Judah in a matter of really less than a calendar year, which is really a big-time overhaul. But notice here, 2 Kings chapter 22, look at the first half of verse 1. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. Now, real quickly, 8 years old. Can you imagine having an 8-year-old king? I mean, have you ever thought, if we had a good second grader, I'd love it if they'd be king. Now, here it is, an 8-year-old, and to go, he's made king, and how long is he going to be king for? 31 years. So, tell me about what age he is when he dies. 39. All right, you can do second grade math. We're doing good. Now, as we go down, I want you to kind of notice a few things really quickly here. Look down at verse 8, same chapter. Then Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, I found the book of the law in the house of the Lord, and Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, who read it. Now, Hilkiah is the high priest. He finds the book of the law, which apparently had been lost for a while or unknown. Well, here it is, and if you kind of take note of the timing here, He comes through it, and in verse 8, he says, here it is together. Now, I made a mistake. Look back at verse 3 so you see the timing of this. Now, in the 18th year of King Josiah, the king sent Shaphan, the son of Azaliah, the son of Meshullam, the scribe, to the house of the Lord. And he's going to go and ask about counting up money for the workmen. But part of what they find in that temple is this book of the law. Now, notice how long has Josiah been king? 18 years. So his age at this point, 18 plus 8, he's 26 years old. So 18 years of those 31 years that he's going to be king have already gone by. Now he's 26. And for the first time, they find within his reign the book of the law. So here, 2 Kings 22, now you look down a little bit further, look at verse 11. He says, when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. What kind of effect does this have on Josiah? And he's heard the law and he realizes really quickly, this is not the way we live. This is not what we do. This is not how we approach things with God. And he's so distraught about it that he tears his clothes. Then, look down a little bit further at verse 20. He actually prays, he asks Shaphan and the high priest to go and intercede for him. And as part of that, God gives an answer. And down in verse 20, we'll just read the tail end of it. Well, actually, read 19. He says, because your heart was tender and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I spoke against this place and against its inhabitants, that they should become a desolation and a curse, and you have torn your clothes and wept before me, I truly have heard you, declares the Lord. Therefore, behold, I will gather you to your fathers, and you will be gathered to your grave in peace. And your eyes will not see all the evil which I will bring on this place. So they brought back word to the king. High priest gets this message from God and says, go tell Josiah this. You go tell him because his heart was humbled, because he tore his clothes out of mourning over the sins of Judah. He says, you tell him he's going to go to the grave in peace. All the evil that I have set apart for Judah, he's not going to see. Now, remember, here's Josiah, 26-year-old man, already been king for 18 years. He hears these things, and I want you to see what he does with it next. I just want you to see the kind of king Josiah is. Chapter 23 opens up. Then the king sent, and they gathered to him all the elders of Judah and of Jerusalem. The king went up to the house of the Lord, and all the men of Judah, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem with him, and the priests and the prophets, and all the people, both small and great. And he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which was found in the house of the Lord. What's the first thing he does? Let's gather all the people together so that we can all hear the same thing. How big is communication? Pretty big. Notice it doesn't matter whether you were great or whether you were small. There's not like, well, these people are insignificant. We don't really need them. He says, no. Great, small, whether you were one of the chiefs, this is one of the elders. He says, everybody gathered together and they read the entire thing. Can you imagine? Getting to hear from God. Now, it had been a long time since these people had heard anything like this. Here he goes through verse 3. The king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord, to walk after the Lord and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, to carry out the words of this covenant that were written in this book. And all the people entered into the covenant. The king made a covenant. He says, I'm going to do everything I can do, all my heart, all my soul. And what was the people's response? We will too. We will do this covenant. We will live this covenant. Now, this is their promise before God. He says, we will honor him. Now, we're not going to take the time to go through really the rest of what's in chapter 23. There's basically more than a calendar, actually a little less than a calendar year, between 2 Kings 22 verse 3 and 2 Kings 23 verse 23. Over the course of this year, I want you to just listen to all of the things that Josiah changed about what was going on there. He says, he burned all the vessels of the gods, Baal and the Asherah, in the valley of the Kidron Brook. Down in verses 15 and 16, he broke down the high places and burned the bones of the dead on the altar, which had actually been prophesied way back in the days of Jeroboam in 1 Kings 13. Verses 19 and 20, the houses of the high places in Samaria and the priests he slaughtered. Verses 21 and 23, the Passover gets reinstated, and it gets celebrated in a way it had not been celebrated since the times of the judges in Israel. I mean, this is a drastic reform toward what is holy and good before God, to keep his covenant. Now, I want you to look down at verse 24. It says, moreover, Josiah removed the mediums and the spiritists and the teraphim, those little, really what those are, tiny trinkets of gods. We would probably call them knickknacks. That's what they would call little carved out images that you could take them on the road with you. They're easy to travel. Teraphim. And the idols, those are the bigger ones. And all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, that he might confirm the words of the law which were written in the book that Hilkiah the priest found in the house of the Lord. What was everything done out of a heart of? What did he want to do? Fulfill, confirm. He says, we're going to live exactly the way that God said we should. Now, he's 26 years old at this point. He's got 13 more years and he'll be dead. Now, here's this period. Look at the way he's described. Look at verse 25. Before him there was no king like him who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. What do you think about Josiah? Best king ever is the way it sounds, doesn't it? Nobody like him before him, nobody like him after him. And so you look at him and go, to actually love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might, who are you thinking about? Isn't that what Jesus did? Think about David, and we think about David's hiccups and his sins. Realize, once Josiah got a hold of this, you see how he changed the complete mindset of the people.
It also sounds like he was trying to get all these people that follow him to do that same thing correctly.
To do the same thing, to do the same thing. So,
I like how it describes the perfect thing that we should think about in the New Testament as well, repentance. Whatever comes before God, he threw it away from it. Got rid of it.
right.
And then he tried to use that momentum towards other people to persuade them to look toward the gospel. And that's how we are supposed to do it. If we see something simple in our lives, that we correct it. And then in the church, we're supposed to encourage others to persuade them to look back.
Right. You think about encouraging others to do the love the Lord with all your heart, soul, strength. We think about mind. As it comes together here, I want you to skip down a little bit further in the chapter. 2 Kings 23, verses 31 and 32. Here's our next king that shows up after Josiah. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah, not the same Jeremiah who wrote the book of Jeremiah. Verse 32, he did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his fathers had done. Fathers is not talking about Josiah. Fathers is talking about all those kings that came before, with rare exceptions. So, you notice, he's 23 years old. He had seen these reforms that his father had brought in for the previous 13 years. Did it have any effect on him? No, it didn't. Now, you notice, how long is he going to be king? 3 months. You're almost kind of surprised that it even mentions him, aren't you? 3 months. Now, skip down to verse 36. Now we run into Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Zebedah, the daughter of Pedaiah of Rumah. He did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his fathers had done. Jehoiakim, similar or different? Very similar. He had gone through these reforms too for 13 years. Did he pick up on anything? No. How disappointing would that be as the people? Because all the people had said, we want to do the covenant. And now to have leaders come in who they don't want to, they do evil. And doing just the opposite. Think about tearing down. Now, notice what comes about in describing his days. Chapter 24, verse 1. In his days, talking about Jehoiakim, in his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. Now, for 3 years, Jehoiakim is relying on who? King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And in relying on him for those 3 years, then he decides what? I don't like this. I'm going to do it my own way. And remember, what did it already say about all of his deeds? They're all evil. Look at the first 3 words of verse 2. Who shows up? The Lord sent. So, notice who stands in full control. Look at the rest of the verse. The Lord sent against him. Notice, it says him. This is very specific. He doesn't say against the nation at this point. He says against him. Bands of Chaldeans, bands of Arameans, bands of Moabites, and bands of Ammonites. So he sent them against Judah to... Now who's it coming against? All of Judah. He says, according to the word of the Lord which he had spoken through his servants, the prophets. He says, was God going to keep his word? Was he going to take out evil? Yes. Notice verse 3. You get a similar kind of phrase. Surely at the command of the Lord it came upon Judah. Who is recognized as doing this? The Lord. You notice it's not, well, this is what the Moabites did, or this is what the Chaldeans did, or this is what the Ammonites did, or the Arameans. He says, surely at the command of the Lord it came upon Judah. Who stands in control of the nations? God does. Do we realize that? Then, he says, to remove them from his sight because of the sins of Manasseh according to all that he had done. The sins of Manasseh go back to what? Do you remember? It's idol worship. These false gods. He says, they've gone back to it. Now that time has continued to pass, now you see the hearts of people changing right back to where they were before. They enjoyed these 13 years in Judah where the king was dead set with all of his heart, with all of his soul, with all of his might to keep the covenant of God, and they enjoyed peace. And he wouldn't have to see what God was going to bring upon the people of Judah. But now that the kings are coming in successively, 3 months. Now here, 11 years. There's going to be another one or 3 months. There's going to be another with 11 years. And you realize, here God's already bringing out his wrath and pouring it out on them. Then if you notice it in verse 4, he says, and also for the innocent blood which he shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord would not forgive. Who brought about the innocent blood? Jehoiakim. He's the one. And that's why this judgment is coming down. Now, as part of this, verse 5. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? Verse 6. So Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and Jehoiachin, his son, became king in his place. The king of Egypt did not come out of his land again, for the king of Babylon had taken all that belonged to the king of Egypt, from the brook of Egypt to the river Euphrates. How much did the king of Babylon take over? Everything from Egypt all the way up to the Euphrates River. Guess what that includes? All of Judah. And who brought it about? God did. Surely at his command. The Lord sent. You realize, just because Judah had responded out of faith during the days of Josiah, was that going to save them forever? No. Because what happened to the hearts of Judah? They went right back to the sins of Manasseh. Right back to wickedness and evil. Isn't it amazing the difference? And because of that, the Lord brings in a judgment against them because of their evil. Now, whenever you see these things come together, now look over at the book of Habakkuk. Look at Habakkuk chapter 1. The Chaldeans are really the tip of the spear that God uses. And you're going to see Habakkuk actually bring the Chaldeans up at least twice. We'll only see probably once tonight. But look at Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 1. The oracle which Habakkuk the prophet saw. Is that kind of an interesting way to begin? Now, Habakkuk is allowed to see what's going to take place in Judah. And as part of that, it brings him to ask some questions. Now, if you kind of notice it, you think about these 13 good years under Josiah, and there's 23 years before they get carried off into Babylonian captivity completely. Does 23 years sound like a long time or a short time to you? Sounds pretty short when you put it into perspective, doesn't it? To think, here's Josiah, described, no king like him before him, no king after him, loved the Lord with all of his heart, soul, all of his might, and to think he's only, after his death, there's only 23 years until all of Judah is going to be taken off into captivity, except for those who are allowed to stay. That doesn't sound very long to me. I don't know about you. If somebody told you, you're only 23 years away from destruction and being carried off as captives, would you think 23 years was a long time or a short time? That sounds really short. Now, here in the mix of these years, if you notice where Habakkuk's prophecies really come in, either sometime in Jehoahaz or sometime in Jehoiakim, somewhere through there, you get this message with Habakkuk. Before they get carried off. There's an initial push that comes around 605 BC, where there's an initial exile, but the big one doesn't come until a little bit later on. But if you notice it here, here's the question, verse 2. How long, O Lord, will I call for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save. How long do I have to call out and you not hear? Did God hear? What would make Habakkuk think that he didn't hear? I don't see a response from God. Is no a response? Is that usually the one that we're ready to accept? No, we think, well, he really wants to say yes, I just need to wait a little longer. Now here's Habakkuk. He says, this is what he saw. He says, if you notice, this is a different kind of response here. Like I said earlier, usually these Old Testament prophets have a message for God's people, what they need to change, what they need to do to be spared. This is Habakkuk saying to God, God, I don't understand you. Do you ever have those kind of moments? I'm not quite sure what God's doing. I know He's working. I know He's righteous. I know He's holy. I know I can trust Him. But I don't understand what's going on here. Is it okay to ask that kind of question? It depends on the heart, doesn't it? Now, he says, I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save. He says, I see the violence all around. I mean, the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, he says, I see them tearing down one place after another. He says, I cry out, you don't save, you don't respond. Verse 3, why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me. Strife exists and contention arises. He says, why do you make me see iniquity? And iniquity is another word for what? Guilt. Guilt. Iniquity is about guilt. He says, why do you make me see guilt? Now, what is Habakkuk seeing that he's not recognizing? If he sees the guilt, what should he know? Is God just? So if you see guilt, what should you expect? You should expect a judgment, right? If you want to think in terms like Galatians chapter 6, God is not mocked. What a man sows, this he will also reap. He says, why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? He says, I got to live right here in the midst of this. Have you ever felt that way? Man, I live in the midst of a wicked place.
Well, it goes back to like Noah, for example, 120 years. God gives the opportunity for us to repent. Even though everything's not bad.
Right.
You got Galatians 19, Sodom and Gomorrah, just like that. So each time he gives people opportunity to repent, it's up to them to do it.
Right. And you see the state of them here.
And then it's ultimate judgment.
Right.
Then he comes in and just wipes it off.
And notice how he continues in 3. He says, yes, destruction and violence are before me. Strife exists and contention arises. Notice how's it going. Is it defusing or escalating? It's escalating. It's getting even higher. He says, destruction and violence are before me. He says, I see it. He says, and strife exists. Anger is getting stirred up. He says, and contentions arise. People are getting more on edge. Then verse 4. He says, therefore the law is ignored. And justice is never upheld. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore justice comes out perverted. Now, notice what happens. When you get away from righteousness, when you get away from what's holy with God, we go, well, you know what? It's not going to be that bad. How's it getting? It's getting worse and worse. Notice the picture in 4. He says law gets ignored. Nobody even cares about it anymore. And then he says, and justice is never upheld. Nobody's held accountable, let alone that. And he says, for the wicked surround the righteous. Are there still some righteous around? Yes. Even in the midst of this destruction and violence, there's still some righteous remnant. Now, he says, therefore justice comes out perverted. Now, just real quickly, whenever Jesus is put on trial, is justice perverted? Yes. When you come over to Acts chapter 5 and the 12 apostles stand before the Sanhedrin and they're scourged for preaching Jesus, is justice perverted? In Acts chapter 7, whenever Stephen stands before the Sanhedrin and tells them about being stiff-necked and hard-hearted, and they stone him to death, and a man by the name of Saul is holding the coats of the witnesses, is justice perverted? Yes. How did it get that way? What was being ignored? Verse 4, therefore the law is ignored, and justice is never upheld. Notice that this is the way it goes. All of a sudden, law gets ignored, and we're talking about Old Covenant law here. He says, and then all of a sudden you turn around and you go, well, justice is being perverted. It's not even being upheld. Somebody's claiming there's justice, but it's not true. It's not righteous. Now, verse 5, you're going to see this take a turn. Now it's not going to be Habakkuk asking the question. You're going to see God making statements and answering these questions. Verse 5, look among the nations, observe, be astounded, wonder, because I'm doing something in your days you would not believe if you were told. Is that what Habakkuk is saying? No, that's what who's saying? The Lord is making this statement. He says, look around, observe it. Just watch what I'm doing. Pay attention. If you ever get in a moment in life where you go, I know I can trust God, I know that He's doing what's righteous, I know He's doing what's holy, but I don't understand. What is the wise spiritual thing to do? Yeah, you take a look at His Word and then you watch and observe. Don't put your head in the sand. Watch and observe. And watch His hand at work. Now, I want you to notice it in the tail end of verse 5. He says, because I am doing something in your days, you would not believe if you were told. He says, if I told you, you wouldn't believe me. You ever have people come up to you and tell you, man, if I told you, you wouldn't believe me anyway. Now, realize this, though. Does God know what they can comprehend? Certainly. This is a little different. This is a God who knows hearts and minds. He says, I could explain it to you, but you wouldn't get it. You wouldn't understand the full picture. And if you kind of notice, there's some contemporaries with Habakkuk as prophets. One of them is a prophet by the name of Jeremiah. And if you're a note taker, write this down. Jeremiah chapter 19. The Lord tells Jeremiah, it's really the whole chapter, verses 1 through 15. The Lord tells Jeremiah, go to the potter and take a piece of pottery. He says, and whenever you do, he says, now go talk to the people. He says, and tell them about what I'm going to do and how I'm going to destroy the city of Jerusalem. He says, I'm going to utterly destroy it. And he goes through talking about going to destroy it by sword, going to destroy it, there's going to be famine, and he even comes down to a point where we might say, man, I don't even know if I could understand that. It comes down to a point where God says, the famines are going to become so disastrous that women are going to cook their children and they're going to eat them. Now, we hear those words. You think we understand that? No, and I don't want to. And you can understand, as he goes on, he says in Jeremiah 19, I'm going to do it because you have worshiped all these other gods up on your rooftops. Which tells you they had gone back to the ways of Manasseh. They had gone back to those wicked abominations before God. So you can understand why God is telling Habakkuk, you would not believe it if you were told. Now, over in the New Testament, Paul's going to quote this, but he's going to use it in a different way about sharing the message of the resurrection of Jesus. He says, I could tell you, but you're still not going to believe it because you're hard-hearted. Well, it was the same problem with the people in Judah. Hard-hearted. They had had an opportunity under Josiah. You could be the righteous, and you could see all this wickedness around you, and would the Lord take care of the righteous? Yes, but what's He going to do with the wicked? There's going to be a destruction, a judgment of God to come down. Now notice how this continues. Acts 13, 41. Verse 6, back in Habakkuk chapter 1. He says, for behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous people, who march throughout the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs. Notice who is raising up the Chaldeans. God is. In the same way, if you think back to whenever the children of Israel were in Egypt, who raised up Egypt? God did. Who did he use? No, he didn't use Pharaoh. He used Joseph. Joseph comes in, interprets the dream, and it sets Pharaoh up so where everything can work together, and all of a sudden, Egypt takes over everything that's there in their region. God raised up Egypt, and then when the 10 plagues came, he utterly destroyed Egypt. Whenever the children of Israel leave there, what's Egypt look like now? Desolation. They're digging graves. Now, you look at this picture, you go, it's so all easy to look at this stuff and go, oh, but look at how strong they are. Look at who is raising the Chaldeans up. Same thing as what he did in Egypt. Same thing as what he's going to do here with Babylon. But notice, as he continues, he says, that fierce and impetuous people, he says, who march throughout the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs. They're just going through, it's almost like they're just gathering up grapes off the vine. Taking possession. Verse 7, notice what this does to the people who are around. He says, they are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. Now, if you were to ask the Chaldeans how they got to be there, what would they say? We did this. He says, we're the ones who decide what justice is. We decide who lives, we decide who dies. Well, and what did that do to the other nations? You talk about fear and dread. Whenever justice doesn't stand as justice anymore, it kind of makes you go, I don't want anything to do with this. And you see the fear and the dread in a completely different way. Maybe you think back to the book of Joshua with Rahab. Remember whenever the 2 spies come into Jericho? And she says, our hearts melted from the moment we heard about the children of Israel passing over the Red Sea on dry ground. In other words, Jericho and Canaan had been ripe for the picking 40 years ago. But because Israel was faithless, they went into the wilderness. And the righteous, Joshua and Caleb, had to endure, right? But the righteous were still there. Even though there was judgments going on all around them for all those 600,000 men who were killed in the wilderness. Now, you notice, there's a fear and a dread. This is different. This is a fear and dread upon the Chaldeans. He says, their justice and authority originate with themselves. Verse 8, their horses are swifter than leopards and keener than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen come galloping. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swoops down to devour. He says, their horses are swifter than leopards. I actually looked this one up. I just got curious. Any guess as to how fast a leopard can run? 36 miles an hour. If you're thinking of a cheetah, you'll have to double that. But a leopard, now you imagine, how fast can you run? I don't. As some people say, if you see me running, you better run too, because something's after me. Do you see why they would be feared and dreaded? Their horses are so fast, there's no way to escape. And remember, who has raised them up? God has. He says, and keener than wolves in the evening. You've ever looked at any documentaries on wolves at night and how they hunt and how they go about things? It is pretty keen. It's amazing what God has put in them. He says, their horsemen come galloping, the horsemen come from afar. You might think you've gone far enough, and then all of a sudden they come right on you. He says, they fly like an eagle swooping down to devour. He says, and it comes all at once. I don't know if you've ever been in a place where all of a sudden a bird just swoops down and takes something and goes back up. It's almost like you blink your eye and it's over. He says it's going to be that fast. Then, verse 9, all of them come for violence. Their horde of faces moves forward. They collect captives like sand. What is their purpose? Violence. To come and to destroy. He says, their horde of faces moves forward. It's like you're watching the army come right at you. this horde of faces ready to devour. Then he says they collect captives like sand. I mean, if you think about being on the beach and just reaching down with your hand to pick up a handful of sand, can you imagine each one of those grains being a captive? Did it take you very much effort to swoop down and get the sand? Probably not. Verse 10, he says, they mock at kings, and rulers are a laughing matter to them. They laugh at every fortress and heap up rubble to capture it. How do they see what's going on? Pretty confident. We might even say pretty arrogant. But they think about themselves in one way, but God's the one who's using them as his rod, his staff. Now, this is going to come against Judah, and he says, they laugh at every fortress. Oh, you think that's really big and tall and strong, do you? Well, we'll just come through and destroy it. He says, rulers are a laughing matter. They boast real big. Chaldeans come through and destroy. He says, they mock at kings. He says, they heap up rubble to capture it. Verse 11, then they will sweep through like the wind and pass on, but they will be held guilty, they whose strength is their God. He says, like the wind that comes and goes, they'll come in, they'll destroy, and then they'll just move on out. He says, and what are they going to leave behind? Just rubble. Now, if you notice the key here, what does God tell Habakkuk? They will be held guilty. Why? Because they're wicked. Because they are guilty. Then he says, they whose strength is their God. Who do the Chaldeans think is giving them all this strength? Their God, themselves. We control justice. We're the ones who do these things. We laugh at kings. And they don't even realize who's using them. God is. Now, you see this picture through the first 11 verses of the book of Habakkuk, and to realize this is the setting, and then to see what God is going to do with these Chaldeans and what he's going to explain to Habakkuk in what he's doing overall. All right. Have a great rest of the week.